All right. Hello, welcome, Griffin. I want to start out today. I found some photos of a trip I took in 1999. Someday maybe I could tell you about it, but it's not planned to be in the syllabus. It was really for me a remarkable time where I had this. I told you I was part of the shock troops of capitalism in the 90s in Russia. And enough of that, I got to a point where was ready to say, you could take this job and shove it. Um, but I responsibly gave notice and resigned, and I went on this great big trip around the mountains of the former Soviet Union. And so I spent a month in the Altai. I went to Kamchatka. I went to Kyrgyzstan in the Pamir Alais, kind of on the border of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I should be showing you a map right now. And also I climbed Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus Mountains. I showed you the where the Caucasus are recently. And to make a long story short, I ended up in Kamchatka with tagging along with some people that one of whom was and is a reporter who was doing some work on how Kamchatka is transitioning through the 90s. He had actually been very involved in the environmental movement. Lots about the Soviet Union we'll touch on just briefly. That really, in the massive project to remake society, eh, we're going to remake the individual. There's going to be something such as the Soviet man, and we're going to remake nature too. And in retrospect, we see a tremendous amount of hubris in these projects to reroute rivers, to bring snow from the mountains of the Pamir, from, well, to bring snow from mountains to water, deserted places. And there was this can-do ethos. We can do anything. Turns out nature's a bit harder to turn around. And so this journalist had been working on the environmental movement in Kamchatka. And so when I tagged along on this trip to Kamchatka and climbed some amazing mountains in Kamchatka, Kamchatka is that peninsula up on the eastern edge of Russia, and it's got some along the rim of fire. So there's a ton of volcanoes, and I'd never seen anything like it. You have completely cylindrical mountains, really remarkable geography. But anyway, while we were there, he wanted to interview, he was doing a story on what had happened to some collective farms, and he tagged me along to kind of hold the microphone, help with the transcription, and hold the camera and stuff. And I have these just very awful little pictures, but I let's see if I can. Oh, this is just a picture. Maybe someday I'll get these digitized. This is a picture from inside a collective farm barn. And it seems to me almost telling that, there you see one cow in the whole barn. Here's another one. And here we have two people that are um, still going to work, still kind of showing up on this collective farm that doesn't get state funding and is sort of limping along and is in this just absolute state of limbo. Here's a look of here's just kind of the buildings from the outside. And you can see there one of those big cylindrical mountains in the back. That's much the scene in Kamchatka. So really beautiful place, remarkable nature. And getting to visit this collective farm was so depressing, right? Like you can, and the 90s, the transition, they were rough. So we'll return to that a little bit. But since we just talked about collectivization, I wanted to show you that picture. And now what we're going to do, and I have my screen on the other side over here. So forgive me if my glance is looking astray. Um, we're going to talk about the purges. So let me move to sharing my screen with you. Yeah. Oh, oh. Well, I am screen sharing, I believe. Okay. The Great Purges. So, the Great Purges are a horrific episode in Soviet history. And for many historians, they represent the apex of what happens when authority goes unchecked. That if, Trotsky, even early on or not early on, Trotsky had, in Revolution Betrayed, posed the question sort of who will guard the guardians if there are no checks and balances, and that authority devolves to the party, and authority in the party, because there isn't democratic process, devolves to the Politburo and then the smaller central committee. But then if you develop a what became cult of personality with just one leader, and what the leader says goes, what is the mechanism for correcting from that in a system? And Trotsky recognized we have a system that has no mechanism for correcting that. And thus we have this tremendous excess in the use of authority that resulted in the deaths of millions of people innocent of the crimes of which they were killed for. Let me, so the deaths of millions of people who were innocent of the crimes of which they were for which they were executed, right? And I kind of want to just make that super duper clear, because sometimes people can operate in different realms, perhaps, right? That we say, well, legally it's technically, but morally it's right. Or, who's really innocent? They did this. We'll talk about whataboutism, and we'll all have a chance to think about the ways in which we deploy whataboutism in our own thinking or argumentation. And short, whataboutism is to, take a particular issue, and rather than confronting that issue, try and find some sort of analogous way in which your opponent or interlocutor is similarly guilty or has done something that merits, um, has done something bad, right? So, kind of, whataboutism is a standard way to deflect attention from one issue onto another. So, um, and in the Great Purge, you have all these people that are accused of being traitors to the Soviet state and die for it. So here we go. We're going to walk through that, and we're going to kind of think about some of the ripple out effects. Um, this the Great Terror, when people look for the roots, they sort of, now we say, well, in the end of the 20s, we already see Stalin really taking the state apparatus in hand. And there are these show trials, and there are these show trials where Bolshevik leaders, I mean, people that are, you know, taking fire and part of the revolution right from the start. Leonid Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, they're his colleagues, leaders, and they are expelled from the party. But not only that, they are put on trial, and in late 1927, for their kind of crimes against the party. And in retrospect, Trotsky ends up being expelled from the Soviet Union, um, and will be murdered by Stalin's henchmen in 1940. Um, and so that episode is a very early sign. And the Siegelbaum article in the Freeze talks a little bit more about that. The murder of Sergei Kirov is an earth-shattering moment. Kirov was also a very prominent Bolshevik in the Leningrad party apparatus, very popular, very capable. Some saw him as having kind of being on an upward trajectory in terms of leadership, and he's murdered December 1st, 1934. As you'll recall, in Journey into the Whirlwind, this is sort of where Yevgenia Ginsburg starts her narrative, and with good reason. The murder has been very controversial. There's suspicion that Stalin himself may have been involved in engineering it, but this remains a contentious historical question. Regardless, Stalin did use this murder as the pretext to introduce draconian laws against political culture and saying, this horrible thing has happened. This leading light has been murdered. And it is the tip of the iceberg in a large conspiracy of wreckers, a network of underground terrorists who would destroy our system. So, in some ways, very much the comments of Stephen Miller in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder for people that have studied Soviet history very much echoes the kind of language that was deployed in the wake of Kirov's murder. And many find this very very alarming. For example, if we can agree on a definition of terrorist, a terrorist should be dealt with the authority of the state. And so to have an employee of the federal government calling sitting judges terrorists is deeply disturbing. What's the solution? If a terrorist is a bad person that should be dealt with, and you have a sitting government official calling sitting judges terrorists, this presents something of a um, what's the solution? Stalin's solution was to have witch hunts against co-conspirators, and people began being arrested. Um, Pause 1 second, I want to. So Stalin implements this change in the law code. And now the law code will read, now the law code promises to punish terrorist organizations and terrorist acts, right? So it's embedded in the language of the state that these terrorist organizations exist in official documents. In retrospect, we now understand what terrorist organizations. As far as we know, they didn't exist. Russia had a long revolutionary movement, but we don't see that. So, but terrorist organizations and terrorist acts were to be investigated for no more than 10 days with no prosecution, no defense attorney, no appeals. It's going to be followed by a sentence to be executed quickly. So Stalin says, we have a situation that is so bad, a threat that is so great that we have the best, that we are justified in circumventing due process for the people in the Soviet Union. Article 58 of the Russian Penal Code had been issued in 1928, is updated in 1934. And 58-1 gives the definition of counter-revolutionary activity. It says, quote, a counter-revolutionary action is any action aimed at overthrowing, undermining, or weakening the power of workers and peasants Soviets and governments of the USSR and Soviet and autonomous republics or at the undermining or weakening of the external security of the USSR and main economical, political, and national achievements of the proletarian revolution, right? And I want you to think about the distance between what it means to take action aimed at overthrowing versus action aimed at weakening. And effectively, this outlaws any opposition, right? So, with this kind of language in the Soviet system, outlaws opposition, demonizes those who might object to a policy, might take action in order to change or modify a policy. I mean, right here, the Great Terror is one of the reasons why throughout the Cold War, we juxtapose the United States of America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, where there is a free, unencumbered press, where everyone is entitled to a defense by a law firm. And of course, no law firm would be punished for doing this action of defending a defendant in a legal case, right? This was like back in the US Revolution. Alexander Hamilton took some heat for defending Tories in the wake of the American Revolution. But that is a fundamental American ideal that everyone is entitled to due process. There is a free press. There is an independent legal apparatus to which every citizen has access to. Here, bracket, you might say, but lawyers are so expensive. Not everyone really has access to the legal system. And if you don't have gobs of money to just appeal decisions, the legal system works different for you. And I'd have to say that is a fair criticism, but don't let reality get in the way of a good story. The United States is a land where there is a functioning judiciary. Everyone has access to due process. There is freedom of speech and freedom of opposition. One of the United States' most famous president, Theodore Roosevelt, insisted that the mark of patriotism is to criticize an administration that is doing badly. And there's no such thing as, America without opposition in the political system. And that's one of the ways in which we contrasted that America in the Cold War contrasted itself to the Soviet Union, where merely opposing a regime policy is criminal. The law code refined in 1934 defined treason. And treason could include contact with foreigners who had counter-revolutionary purposes. It included aiding the international bourgeoisie. It included not reporting treasonous activities. And what's key here is the revolution is not just political, life is a political act. So much is subject to scrutiny now. If you are not, this logic means if you are not helping the revolution, you are hurting it. If you don't mourn appropriately at the appropriate moments, you can be an enemy. Article 58-7, called the undermining of state industry, transport, monetary circulation, or credit system, as well as of cooperative societies and organizations with counter-revolutionary purpose as defined by 58-1, by means of the corresponding usage of the state institutions, as well as by opposing their normal functioning. Such a crime, so any crime like this, undermining normal functioning of economic activity, slouch or run your shift, that such a crime was now equivalent to inciting armed insurrection against the regime and classified you as being an enemy of the people. Economic wreckers get the death penalty. Think about, some of you may be old enough to recognize the Enron Council, where you had reckless and illegal financial transactions that led to playing with the funds of millions of people, wrecking their pensions. Um, um, well, let me leave n of how many people's pensions were wrecked blank, and you can learn more about it in the documentary film "The Smartest Guys in the Room." And um, but this sort of thing, I mean, we've got some real economic wrecking, and those perpetrators that were finally sent held it to any degree accountable were sent to a kind of white collar crime prison. And it has been reported that at their arrest, the police officers did not touch them physically. These were rich white men, and they were much more politely arrested. Nothing like what Terrence Crutcher or George Floyd faced in their apprehensions on the street. And I'm leaving out some other names. At any rate, so economic wrecking is same as insurrection against the state. This is a crime to be killed for. Section 10 of Article 8 made propaganda and agitation against the Soviet Union a crime. So much for free speech. Keep in mind, the Soviet Constitution insists that Soviet citizens have free speech. An enemy of the people becomes a very loose term. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago had the following to say about Article 58. I'm quoting from Solzhenitsyn here. Who among us has not experienced its all-encompassing embrace? In all truth, there is no step, thought, action, or lack of action under the heavens which could not be punished by the heavy hand of Article 58. Family members were also subject to arrest and exile, if not worse. So, guilt by association, absolutely a thing. Schools encourage their students to report on parents that might say disloyal things, and we had some of that. And then on July 1937 came Order Number 447. This was under the um, jurisdiction of Yezhov. Here's a picture of Nikolai Yezhov, who is the head of the political police. This is the branch of the government that is investigating and covering political crimes. And uh, from July 1937 until November 1938, 766,000 people were arrested. That's 750,000 people in just over 1 year. Well, is it 1 year and 1.25 years? 385,000 people of these people were categorized as, or they were put in category 1, which means they were shot immediately. And category 2 got 5 to 10 years in the gulag. Who were these people? Well, very important people. Zinoviev ends up, he'd been on the show trial and he groveled for forgiveness in the 27 trial. In 35, he's put on trial for moral complicity. Moral complicity, which essentially, I think you might sympathize with. I think you might sympathize with those bad people. Boom. Um, Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed in a trial of 16 old Bolsheviks. It happened in August of 1936, and it really shook the regime. Stalin is, as it's been put, Stalin is killing people who, would walk through fire to do his bidding. Bukharin is executed on March 15th, 1938. And he has this, I didn't sign it to you the semester, but he has a confession letter, pathetic to read, really, where he writes Koba. That was a nickname for a nickname for Stalin among those that were close and in the inner circle. Koba, why do you need me to die? Here's someone that understands how things work, understands himself to be stainless in terms of his loyalty to the revolution. Koba, why do you need me to die? It was important for Stalin to get confessions from everyone. And as we saw in the Ginsburg trials, that pressure to report on other people. Keep this thing going. We'll have more names. I actually, as an aside, in the 17th century, there were very few witch trials in Russia, and Valerie Kivelson has done fantastic research in this, and she's found that there was also an attempt to say in witch trials from the early modern era, far more in Western Europe than were in Russia. But one feature of these trials was to say, report who were you in cahoots with, who was doing, worshiping the devil along with you. And what they found, what Valerie Kivelson has found, is that peasants would often say, if forced to say a name, would say a name of someone who had died or, was far, far away. And in a state that didn't have, the modern record keeping apparatus of visibility in the way that modern states did. She's kind of interpreted this as a kind of way to, get out of the torture without bringing harm to another person. Anyway, that's so back into the 20th century, back into the Great Terror. And this really got to be tremendous. It really gripped society and educated society. Historians have continued to ask why this happened. So Nikolai Yezhov is one of the perpetrators of the terror as the head of the NKVD, and he himself in 1939 falls victim to it. And when he falls victim to it, he needs to be disappeared. Here is a picture of Stalin walking with Yezhov, and then the commissar, once he'd been found guilty, the picture is reproduced. The Soviets innovate on Photoshop. He's removed from the photo. So here they are all walking together, and here he's gone. There's been lots and lots of questions about the purges. One of them, did Stalin know what was happening? There's this, is it really coming from him, or are people just getting out of hand? Remember, I told you about that 1932 speech, Dizzy with Success, where Stalin himself says, some people have just gotten a little bit out of hand. They're overzealous, which we've interpreted as a kind of a gentle sign from the leader. The leader won't formally backtrack off his own initiatives, but kind of as a gentle sign that maybe a little slowing of the pace of collectivization and industrialization is in order. We now know the archives are released. Stalin absolutely knows what's going on. Here is a list of people to be arrested and Stalin's signature on it. As we've said, Stalin put in the hours. He spent a long time working. Here's that picture of him again, working in his office in the Kremlin. And he, once the archives were opened up, this question of, maybe he wasn't really directing this. Maybe it was something that gained momentum. He signed the lists. He knew. Um, and so if collectivization and is hitting the peasants, kind of a sort of war against the peasants almost, and industrialization is hitting the workers, the Great Terror, it goes for kind of the educated classes, university educated, administrative, bureaucratic people, scientists, like people involved in science and scholarship, like Yevgeny Ginsburg. This doesn't exclusively, I mean, it'll get everyone, but this is when this is kind of the episode that comes after them. And as in the case of Ginsburg, a party loyalist. Why is this happening to me? One explanation that's been suggested is that contributed, although Stalin signed the lists, leadership matters. This is coming from the top. That said, there were many people who found promotions filling the spots of those that had been removed. So you did have this kind of upward mobility um, for a certain layer of society that some have said this may have, in some albeit twisted way, contributed to a sort of, well, I didn't think they were a traitor, but the leader, you don't know. Sometimes you don't know. Anything can happen. These sorts of rationalizations. Um, as I said, Stalin insisted on confessions, and we even have this one joke that's emerged. I'll tell you a Soviet joke. Oh boy, oppressed they may have been, but the Soviets could be really funny. Some of the funniest jokes. Here's one. One nasty morning, Comrade Stalin discovered that his favorite pipe was missing. Naturally, he called in his henchman, Lavrentiy Beria, and instructed him to find his pipe. A few hours later, Stalin found it in his desk and called off the search. But Comrade Stalin, stammered Beria, 5 suspects have already confessed to stealing it. It was very important to get the confessions. Um, So, again, why is this happening? Is Stalin trying to eliminate personal enemies? Is he paranoid? Is he trying to generate widespread fear? Is he trying to really motivate the population? Don't even think about stepping out of line. Is it the public participation that, as morbid as it is, there are some winners in this episode? Someone got Eugenia Ginsburg's job. And these upward movers, their name even emerged. The sorry, excuse me, Vydviženci. Vydviženci. It's a hard word for me to say. Those that moved upward during this process. And we know now there's a smoking gun. Um, Stalin authorized all of these. For example, um, I'll just share with you a document that from the Hoover Institute. It acquired documents irrefutably establishing that the terror was widespread and personally directed by Stalin and his Politburo. In 2 days in July in 1937, a few of the many top secret resolutions on anti-Soviet elements were approved by Stalin, and they and showed them consigning tens of thousands of people in 2 days, tens of thousands of people to execution and slow death in the Gulag. A July 10th, 1937 Politburo resolution confirmed that 1,881 kulaks were selected to be shot and 4,259 for exile, an exile from which few would return. So there, it's not all professionals, kulaks, farmers. A later resolution on the same day selected an additional 14,000 people for execution and nearly 31,000 for exile. The next day, the Politburo selected another 6,900 kulaks for shooting and some 15,700 for exile. Thus, we get a figure of some 23,000 people shot and 51,000 sent to the Gulag in just 2 days. This is mind-boggling stuff. And tallying the losses from as a whole, tallying the losses of a whole, as a whole from the Great Terror. 1937-38 is when things seem to peak. And it even gets a name, Yezhovshchina, that, Yezhov is the head of the secret police during this time. He's pretty much running things. 85% of the executions that took place in the USSR from 1917 to 1955 happened during this year. 1.7 million people were arrested for political crimes, and between 900,000 and 1.2 million people were shot quickly. Thousands more were sent to the Gulag. Stalin's death toll is, I believe, unmatched in history. The um, I want to show you a couple pictures. Let's see how we're doing on time. As you know, I lived and worked in Moscow in 19 from 1997 to 2000 before I became a graduate student. And as a graduate student, I lived over 2 more years in Russia in various places. But I lived in Moscow for 2 years and St. Petersburg for 1 year with respect in my job, working for a startup transport company. And I would often walk by this building. This building is just down in Moscow center, and it was a hotel. And if you look closely at this building, what do you notice about its symmetry or lack of it? You'll see that it's different. The left side is the design is somewhat different from the right side. Why is it like that? Urban legend has it that the architect of this building came in to show Stalin the blueprints and get approval. Stalin maybe missed that he was being shown two different designs. He signed off on the plans. He signed off on the plans in a way where his signature was on across two different sheets of paper representing two different plans. The architect, realizing what had happened, was terrified to take more of the great leader's time to ask for clarification and was unclear on what to do, and so built from both plans. This is the urban legend. It is repeated in guidebooks everywhere. I have been unsuccessful in, kind of getting down to the solution itself. I have there is a bunch of reading about the 1920s, sort of seeing that one of the kind of radical innovations of architecture that people talked about was asymmetrical building. That bourgeois order made things symmetrical for years. We're going to do things differently. And I have found evidence of a couple of exhibits with maybe a model or a picture showing asymmetrical structures. I'm unaware of any real kind of movement and intentional manifestation of building asymmetrical buildings in the Soviet Union. And so I have to leave it at that level of urban legend. But one but one that may have some plausibility to it. And there's a building that I walked by everywhere. By the way, so here is once Yezhov himself fell victim to the very movement that he was, the mover and shaker in executing. Beria was replaced him as the NKVD. He was a frightening figure in his own right. And if any of you have seen the movie The Death of Stalin, um, I highly recommend it. And in the death of Stalin, Beria, after Stalin dies, is taken downstairs and shot. And in some ways, the Soviet Union with this comes to a truce that we're not going to have political executions anymore. The violence needs to stop. We'll get there. Um, Kind of back to the Great Terror and all these, a million people or so, a million-ish people in a year being taken out and shot or sent to the Gulag. What happened? Well, it just sort of petered out. No explanation from the top, no sense of accountability, no recognition that any injustice had been done. And we won't get that until in the just slightest whiff when Khrushchev is the leader of the Soviet Union, and we have this episode, De-Stalinization. We'll talk about it. It's I want to manage your expectations. Don't get too excited. Essentially, they said there might have been some excesses, is as close as the regime gets to acknowledging any wrongdoing in this horrific episode that resulted in the um, death or exile of millions of people. The I want to spend just a few minutes on talking about, let's go back to this idea of confessions. It wasn't enough to just, um, take your freedom. You needed to confess to. The state was right. The state is always right. And Stalin really insisted on truth. And so, following the arrest and punishment of Lavrentia Beria, this the who had been the head of the secret police, in 1953, the encyclopedia, the Brockhaus, the very big Soviet encyclopedia, it's an excellent, excellent resource in many, many ways. Um, subscribers to this subscribers to this encyclopedia all over the world. And this is the I'm going to show you the pictures from the University of California, Berkeley copy. Subscribers received in the mail an addendum, a letter from the editor instructing them to cut out and destroy um, a certain number of pages. And so it says in the fifth tome of the encyclopedia, 21, the pages 21, 22, 23, 24. It just says the page number. We just instruct you to go to your volume 5, cut out with a razor very carefully 4 pages, and insert in them these 4 pages that we're sending you with this mailing. And those pages were the encyclopedia article about Lavrentia Beria, important leader, hero in the Soviet system, and praising his work and service to the Soviet Union. That history had to be not just rewritten, but disappeared. And instead, subscribers to the encyclopedia received a 4 page article on the Bering Sea, including even photographs, as if they hadn't had enough time. And so it was very important to control truth. There's lots of disappearing people. Here is the very poet Mayakovsky ended up killing himself. He had a female, his was very close associate with Lenya Brick, who is, by the way, the model for this piece of Soviet propaganda about the importance of reading that I showed you later. When she fell afoul of the regime, she was disappeared from photos. And there was, and Trotsky even wrote about, he wrote the Stalin School of Falsification. The Stalin School of Falsification, he writes, it's published in Berlin in 1932, how it's so important to falsify history. And it's really mind-boggling how these things can coexist alongside each other. And I want to emphasize that the Soviet Union insisted all along that citizens have free speech. And I want to just remind you of how in February 2025, J.D. Vance went to Munich, and the speech he gave there really berated Germans for in Germany in the wake of the Holocaust, they have made serious hate crimes. That sovereign country in the wake of the Holocaust, which resulted in the deaths of millions of innocent Jews and millions of Eastern Europeans and millions of people, has made hate crimes. And J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, criticized those laws. And he said, insulting someone is not a crime. Criminalizing speech is going to put real strain on European US relationships here. This is kind of, he tweeted the gist, and he said, this is Orwellian. Everyone in Europe and the US must reject this lunacy. And so here we have the US coming out very strongly. The US believes in free speech. Make no mistake about it. Is essential to having a free people. Freedom of expression is essential. And simultaneously, however, about the same time, I want to show you the confirmation hearing of Feinberg. And we're going to listen to this, these few moments.
Execution would be your job, and it's part of the job. But I don't think it's all the job. You're going to often find yourself in the room. And when things like, as an example, the SecDef a few days ago said, when asked whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine, he said it's complicated. It's not complicated. Russia did, in fact, invade our ally, Ukraine. So, Mr. Feinberg, would you agree that you have a role beyond just execution in offering some advice when you hear things that are just fundamentally inaccurate?
I do think the deputy should at times give his view on policy, for sure. I think it should be behind closed doors and not in public. And I think it's important for the deputy to understand that he, regardless of what his opinion may or may not be, that ultimately the secretary and the president will decide what the policies are, and it's important to execute it.
That's fair. That's good to hear. Mr. Feinberg, did Russia invade Ukraine?
Well, going to my behind closed doors statement a second ago, I'll just say this.
That's essentially enough. In a society of free speech, under oath, this nominee to be second in command in the Department of Defense was unable or chose not to unequivocally answer the question, did Russia invade Ukraine? And some people, including myself, find this moment deeply, deeply troubling. As and I want to, and why does it? Why is one of the reasons troubling? For we're at time, so those of you that need to go, please, you can go, and we can, and you can just pick up the last example that I'm going to share, which is something of a civics lesson in party, which kind of returns us to something of a civics lesson. Levetsky and Ziblatt have written a book, How Democracies Die. And that one of the ways in which democracies are undermined is when there is this process they call capturing the referees. If the institutions of the state are managed by individuals who do not share in the common foundation of how a society should work, this is very, very dangerous for societies. And so, what the United States has seen, so January 6th has stood out as a very strong example and a real warning flag that we had for the first time in American history an American president who refused to accept the peaceful transfer of political power and fomented an insurrection at the Capitol on the day to certify the votes. Nearly 1,600 individuals were charged. There were of all of those trials, in 258 federal trials that had already occurred when Levitsky and Ziblatt published this, there had been two acquittals. In other words, the judicial system saw that 256 out of 258 on procedural and substantive grounds were legitimate. There were zero findings of selective prosecution, of malicious prosecution, which are violations of the law. You're not allowed to wield the law against someone just because you don't like them, you think they've done you wrong in the past, and you want revenge on them. So, in the way that James Comey has now been indicted, for example, um, in the wake with the installation of the Trump regime, the prosecutors who worked on that, dozens of them have been fired, and investigations have been launched against people who participated in that. So, what we are seeing is a rewriting of the history of January 6th. The president has called it a day of love. Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, has said by and large it was a peaceful protest. Representative Andrew Clyde, Republican from Georgia, has characterized it as a normal tourist visit. The first day of the new presidency, the rioters were pardoned. Justice Department employees have been purged who worked on the prosecutions have been purged. The they well, this happened with Jim Johnson was instrumental in creating a weaponization working group. We'll say more about that. Ashley Babbitt, one of the insurrectionists who was killed by Capitol employees defending the representatives, and here are images of representatives hiding and them trying to block doors. She has been offered full military honors. One, Jared Wise, who was arrested as an insurrectionist for the insurrection on January 6th, one of the rioters, he has been pardoned. He has been hired by the Department of Justice and is working on the weaponization of law enforcement. So this is the word being applied. And the Department of Justice, this is words from Project 2025, authored by Russell Voigt, who is now the head of the Office of Management and Budget, has embedded in the words of their program that the Department of Justice has been captured by unaccountable bureaucratic managerial class and radical left ideologues. Again, because we've been studying radical leftists in the Bolshevik Revolution, I can't help but comment on the whether just doesn't understand or is maliciously, whether it's through ignorance or malice, a misdeployment of what is historically understood as a radical left ideologue, but or embedded in the offices and components. And so and we're seeing that other moves happen. For example, the Department of Justice we're seeing a rewriting of the record. You know, an insurrection being described as a day of love. People properly prosecuted under our legal system being victims of weaponization of government against them. The victimhood is important. And we're seeing the record that did exist from the Department of Justice disappearing from the Department of Justice website. And here is just one example. With some deeper digging, some of these records are still findable for the time being. We'll see what happens. But just as in, when are historical comparisons appropriate and not appropriate? God bless the world. Let us hope the world never ever sees something like Stalin's purges again. But if we look at, but I do want to point out the use of words embedded in Article 58 and the ways of defining the problem, the ways words are used, can be catalyst and justification for indefensible actions. And so, as ever, it is important to pay attention to the way words are used. Skipping a bit, which way out of this morass? People are entitled to different opinions. And I think that one way out of this morass, um, Hannah Arendt, the author of On the Origins of Totalitarianism and Other Works, once said, in On Revolution, she writes the following. What makes it so plausible to assume that hypocrisy is the vice of vices is that integrity can indeed exist under the cover of all other vices except this one. Only crime and the criminal, it is true, confront us with the perplexity of radical evil. But only the hypocrite is really rotten to the core. And so, hypocrisy, what's hypocrisy? Accusing someone of something, doing something that you yourself say is wrong to do. So people can have different views on what's right, what's not right, but to do it is, but we can judge you by your own standards if we judge hypocrisy. Was one measure of Hannah Arendt that one way out of one way to make judgments about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, when is someone acting in good faith, when is someone not acting in good faith. And so I just want to end on turning your attention to the tremendous scandal that occurred in the United States of America when Bill Clinton, the former president of the United States, confronted the Attorney General on a tarmac in Arizona in June of 2016. And he entered her plane and they had a 20-minute conversation. Hillary Clinton was at the time a candidate for president of the United States, and she was under investigation for misusing emails. Indeed, she had sent emails on her home server that she should not have sent. They included an email of birthday wishes to some heads of state in Africa. Um, and this was by the protocol that wasn't the type of thing that should be sent through a home email as any communication to a head of state. And Donald Trump weighed in on this conversation that it was inappropriate for anyone close to or anyhow associated to even have contact with the attorney general, who's supposed to work independently. And Donald Trump tweeted, or sorry, no, these are words from an interview. I think it's the biggest story, one of the biggest stories of this week, of this month, of this year. I've been talking about the rigged system, how it's rigged, and this is terrible. You see a thing like this, and even in terms of judgment, how bad of judgment is it for him or for her to do this? I mean, who would do that? The Attorney General is supposed to work independently and absolutely uninfluenced by any outside forces as they pursue their mission of upholding the law. On September 20th, 2025, Trump posted publicly a message to the Attorney General in which he called on her to go after people that he perceives to be his enemies. And with that, we can just return to Hannah Arendt's remarks about hypocrisy. I'll see you on Friday, and we'll talk about Yalta.